Please welcome for the first time, Todd Hone and Carrie Usher.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you. I'm sorry I missed rock, paper, scissors. I wish I'd have been here for that. So I'm Todd, this is Carrie. We're going to tag team this presentation this morning. And what I really want to hope, what I really hope you leave this with is operational changes that you can make in your organizations. And so we're going to take you through a case study that we were part of implementing. And we've done this multiple times at multiple organizations, but this one specifically was an organization where I was a leader of. Prior to this process, I was an advocate for human and organizational performance, developed our first operational learning model back in 2008 with the first roundtable we hosted at Vanderbilt University. And so we've been working on this for a long time, but it wasn't until 2016 when I moved to the dark side, is your mic off? That we actually put these things in action in organizations we were leading. So I think the information will be helpful to you and hopefully change some of the concepts or mindsets that you have related to this. So let me start with some context, because context is important. The organization was a utility company. The organization had hired contractors for vegetation management services. They were experiencing 3 fatalities per year. Since the program was put in place in the beginning of 2017, they've had 0 fatalities. When the program was put in place, they had about 1,500 contractor employees working 10, 12-hour days, 6 days a week, working trees. Today, they have 6,000 contract employees working 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day. So context in terms of what this case study entails. So we started this process, and even when we were trying to operationalize this for organizations, meeting with a lot of executives, there's really 4 things on their mind. First is eliminating waste. Injuries of any type, especially those that are serious of nature, are truly expensive to an organization from a dollar perspective, but also have reputational risk aspects associated with them. Am I a safe employer? Do people want to come work for me? So that's something that's on executives' minds. The second one, and this is what I hope to leave you with today, is the frustration associated with individuals or organizations trying to help you in terms of SIF, serious injury fatality, or fatality serious injury, FSI, prevention tools and mechanisms. The organization I walked into, and I took the leadership role for, I had 170 people on my team, 50,000 employees between contractors and direct hired employees, union operation, and they were spending millions with an outside consultant on their SIF processes. And they had 17 SIF checklists, and they were going out every day doing serious injury fatality inspections, observations, without a lot of benefit or outcomes associated with that. Carrie's going to talk about that process and how that needs to evolve. The third thing executives are concerned with is reducing uncertainty, i.e. catastrophic failure. How do I prevent catastrophic failure in what is deemed a stable system in my organization? Our total recordable incident rate is low, but our fatalities aren't improving, our severity is going up. How do we address that issue? And the last one, and really most important for all of us, is the moral responsibility of being an executive in an organization and protecting human life. No one wants to be in that position to have to make that call when something bad happens. So that's, foundational to this. And what you need to understand is if your leaders aren't engaged, I'm going to talk about one key aspect of this process in terms of how things have to change for this to be effective, requires full commitment from the leadership. Because we're going to talk about stop work, which I think every organization in here has, but we're going to introduce a concept called start when safe. And there's aspects of that that are critical in order for this program to be successful. So we have the perfect storm, and this really exists in a lot of our organizations where we have dynamic high-risk hazards, especially post-COVID, I say post-COVID, we're still in COVID, but in the current state we have in dealing with the pandemic the last 2 years, We have low resource availability, especially skilled resources. And the third one is a lot of production pressures. Depending on what industry you're in, there's supply chain shortages. So when materials come in, you got to go to work, get stuff done. So there's always an aspect of production pressure associated with this. In terms of the vegetation management work, again, perspective. In that left-hand picture, very hard to see, there's a big arrow pointing to a worker that's 120 feet up on a tree. And the area that they're working in, there's 170 million, that's with an M, million dead or dying trees due to excessive drought over the course of many years and bark beetle. And if you're a utility, you are responsible for maintaining the assets that could come in contact, or the environment that could come in contact with my assets. So a 150-foot tree, if it were to fall over because it's dead and strikes my asset, I'm responsible for uptime for my customers. I'm measured by that, by the Public Utility Commission, but I also could face other litigation associated with that. We hosted our first roundtable after I experienced the second fatality in less than 3 months being at the organization. We invited leaders of the company, so principals of those organizations. I had my executive team, I had Cal OSHA in the room, and I had safety folks. And we mapped out the commitment side of this equation to help drive the changes we were going to make. Why is this important? Top right, this work combines two of the top 10 most dangerous occupations in the United States today when we think about fatalities: working around energized equipment and tree work. So you have a really high risk environment these individuals are in. And just the bottom right is just to give you a sense of the types of assets, or not assets, but the types of trees that were being worked, how big they are. So 6,000 workers doing veg management, they don't exist in Northern California, so they're traveling in from other parts of the country. And an oak tree in Illinois is a lot different than something you would encounter in Northern California. And some of these trees are so dead that the act of climbing them could cause them to collapse under the weight of the individual. So the dynamic and the risk had changed considerably. I want to give you this story because it's important in terms of how we think and how we change what we do. So I know Tesla was here yesterday. I know Tesla's in the room. But Henry Ford is the quote that I use in reference. So a lot of people think that Henry Ford invented the assembly line for the automotive industry. It was invented long before he got involved with automotives. What he did is brought that to the automobile manufacturing process, and through that innovation, made cars affordable for every human in the United States, lowered the cost. And here was his saying: if you always do what you always done, you always get what you always got. And so when I looked at these 17 SIF checklists, and they spent a lot of money creating these checklists, and then I looked at the results of the observations, and 50% of them were PPE related, not wearing your PPE, safety glasses, gloves, whatever it would be. I'm not discounting those as important. But then I look at the fatality side of this with a serious injury piece, and those had not improved and actually were getting worse. So we had to change our focus. We had to do something different. The roundtable was the foundation to drive that change. We immediately established leadership commitment, and then that allowed us to enact and go meet with employees that do the work and understand how that was performed. So what we started to think about, and what we helped the leaders think about in that roundtable initially, and again, the participants were from the industry, the principals, my executive team, safety people, Cal OSHA, is shift the focus away from who failed to what failed. And what systems and processes could we put in place, knowing that this industry is still a long ways to go in terms of fall protection and equipment that can actually take down trees and deal with the terrain that they're at, where you got to walk 3 miles in to work a tree, all those aspects of that. And that was the foundation for where we started to change this process. Carrie? Carrie's going to talk about the observation piece, which is an element that is important here, right?
So I want to talk about, as safety professionals, what's gotten us to where we are today. And I'm talking about as an industry. So we're going to take a look at this case study, bringing a lot of data together that says, what is it that we're doing and what are we trying to accomplish? And from that, we're going to be able to see basically the trap, the things that we're doing wrong that we can improve. And we're going to use the observation process to kind of be that lens to show us that. So in this model, let's take a look at a traditional observation program. So what is the purpose of an observation program? Why do we do them? Why do you want people out there saying, hey, what's going on? Are we doing this correctly or not? What's the purpose? Anybody? To identify what? To identify risk. Okay, for what purpose? Drift. Okay, for what purpose though? Okay, I see that on the slide. Okay, so the purpose is we want to see what's going wrong and what we can do to fix it before it leads to an injury. That's kind of the purpose, right? We're going to see it. If it's not working, let's address it before it becomes an issue. So the expectations are we want people out there looking. Okay, that's the purpose or the plan. So now we're going to have people go out there, they're going to observe and do that initial correction. Traditionally, that's a whack-a-mole process. I find it, I fix it, I move on, and I never look back. Most companies have that. We call that the plan, do, hope, pray methodology. Okay? We hope and we pray nothing bad's going to happen. But what we are not traditionally good at is what are we continually seeing and why are we continuing to see it? So the study piece is basically saying we should review what people are saying that we're doing, right? What are we finding? And do we have any gaps or trends? A gap would be something like, hey, I want to go out and look at something, but we're not looking at it. Okay, you have this big checklist, but people focus on just a small subset of the questions, for example. Okay, or a trend is what are we seeing over and over and over again? Okay, so we should be doing that. Now, I'll give you a good example, right? If there's oil on that floor, is that good or bad? Bad, right? We're going to clean it up, right? We'll mark it down. That was not safe. And then we'll leave. We'll come back later. There's oil on the floor. Is that good or bad? Bad. I'll clean it up. I'll mark it down. We'll move on. Come back the next day. There's oil on the floor. What am I going to do? What? Where is it coming from, right? But think about that as you look at all your observations. Are we doing that? Are we saying, where is that coming from? Why is that happening? So that's what we want to do. So we want to drive that action to give that feedback, develop those action plans, and ultimately make data-driven decisions. So that's kind of the process of why we have these observation programs. But if you don't have these components, you're going to get that whack-a-mole process. Just like Todd said, people have these checklists. There's a lot of activity going on where we're getting zero to very little benefit from it. So let's take a look at this. So I've been in organizations that basically measure this process. And several things that we found were when you look at basically incident rates, we found that the more people doing observations, going out and having these conversations, the more the better. That's the left-hand view. Okay, the more people you have out there and having observations, having those conversations, the better off it is. That makes sense, right? 2 or 4 eyes are better than 2, and 8 are better than 4, so on and so forth. But this is the one that blew me away. As a safety professional, on the right, it said, those organizations where the only people doing that are safety people had the highest number of injuries. I'm going to repeat that. The organizations, actually, each of those diamonds represents a location, a project, a facility. The places where the only people doing observations were safety people had the highest injury rates. Okay. As soon as you started to get team involvement outside, you started to see a vast reduction. And if you see the 0 and see, wow, it's best at 0, that doesn't mean they got rid of the safety people. That means safety people relegated the role of to where it should be, which is the line supervision, right? And the point into the spear. Okay. So now we need more people out there doing these observations, but we need to be looking at the right things. Millions of points of data gave me this chart. and is basically saying, hey, PPE, basic administration, housekeeping makes up over 60% of the findings on millions and millions. Actually, I think this chart was over 100 million observations. High frequency, low severity, easy to look at. That's where you're getting your activity for observations. Half of it PPE related. Okay. So how did we get here? I hate to beat on Heinrich, but I'm going to. Okay. For every one major injury, there's the 29 minor and 300 no injury accidents, right? That's the Heinrich triangle. Okay. But as we look back at this, let me go back. As we look at this, a lot of people saw that, hey, if I focus on the bottom of the pyramid, I'm going to address basically everything. And that's kind of how we got here. So let's take a look at this chart right here. The blue line represents basically injury rates over time. This is right from BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics from OSHA, right? And it's showing a marked reduction in our injury rates overall, year over year for over 2 decades. The red represents our fatality rates. Okay. Notice how it's plateaued and now it's starting to increase. And for the first time ever, our fatality rates exceed our injury rates. So again, how did we get here? Okay. First of all, not all at-risk findings are alike. Okay. High frequency usually aligns with lower severity. I just told you, where are people focusing their attention? On the minor stuff. Okay. This data supports it. So let's take a look at back here. What is driving our efforts as safety professionals? What is driving the effort from management is injury reduction. Injury reduction comes mostly from high frequency, low severity items. Okay. So now if I focus my attention on those minor items, I will reduce my injury rates. That makes everybody look good, especially as a safety professional. At least that's the mindset. However, it's not necessarily good to prevent significant injuries and fatalities. Why? Because my prevention efforts are going to high frequency, low severity. So let's take a look at this. All injuries contribute to the injury rate, which creates the illusion that reducing incidents with minor consequences is automatically going to reduce the number of major incidents. That is how we twisted Heinrich. What he really said in his seminal work was, for every mishap resulting in an injury, there are other similar accidents that cause no injuries. So it is no blanket approach, but that's kind of how we've twisted it. So let's take a look, for example. We're going to look at the proximate causes of something like a fall, okay? And then go deeper and deeper down. So obviously, if I have a fall from a height, I'm not tied off or I'm tied off inappropriately. Okay, those would be like this, what we would call, or some people would call that sole proximate cause. But obviously going down deeper, well, why wasn't he tied off, or why was he tied off improperly? Was it training? Was it, these latent error traps that really exist in safe work and unsafe work? Okay. But regardless of all that, do you see anything related to, was he wearing his eyeglasses, right? Was he wearing gloves, right? No. And what we really have derived from this significant injury fatality prevention is, if you don't focus on significant injuries and fatalities, you're not going to have a good job of preventing significant injuries and fatalities. Okay? So instead of constraining the workers with, ask them what we can do to make things safer. So what we're going to get into is switching to focusing on significant injury fatalities, or at least on what is going to get people significantly hurt or killed, right? And what can we do to prevent that? And we're going to talk about tying the controls with the hazard, because most checklists that we have don't necessarily do that. We kind of talk about hazards. We kind of talk about things that we should be seeing, but we don't necessarily tie the hazard with the control. So Todd's going to take over, and we're going to talk about the case study that, based on those revelations, right, we came up with a different approach to say, let's focus specifically on these things, and let's talk about how we can protect people in the field and make it easier for them to recognize, right, and to not proceed unless those things are ready. Okay.
So I heard Carrie say that you need to focus on SIF to prevent SIF. And I already shared with you this case study they had committed to, spent millions of dollars creating 17 SIF checklists. So they had understood from previous performance what were the things that were causing the serious injuries. But what they did with that is where we had to step in and modify that approach, because just creating a SIF checklist assumes that that SIF checklist is addressing all the conditions that they may encounter. In addition, most traditional processes related to job site inspections and job site observation programs are still relying heavily, a tremendous amount, on the worker to understand the risk and to understand the controls associated with that. And so by blowing up the Heinrich model, by blowing up the 17 checklists, it allowed us to take a step back and look at this through the lens of the employees, and more importantly, take this down to the task level. A checklist is at a condition level, right? So they had a checklist for working at heights. That was one of their SIF checklists. They had a SIF checklist for dog bite prevention. They had a SIF checklist for working around energized equipment. First question on every one of those checklists was PPE, and then it would get into certain things or certain conditions. But the checklist never really got into the control side of the equation. And that's one nuance that we changed through this process. And I'm going to walk you through how that process was constructed and how that looks different today versus how it looked different before. So there's three things we know as leaders, and I put human organizational performance, could be safety, professional, I don't care what it is, but more rules won't make us safer. This organization had 5,000 plus policies. Average policy was about 18 pages. How well do you think they were understood? How well do you think the updates were understood? How complex did they make it for their contractors to do the work that they needed to do? Pretty complex. We've made it very hard for employees to do the things that we need them to do, and leaders of those organizations. Fundamental will never understand or imagine all the ways workers can fail. So think about a recent event review. I call them event reviews, not investigations, but you'll see investigations in this deck. But in event reviews, think about the process and the worker perspective or the context of the work they were doing and how that changed from when they started the work until they ended in the outcome that they had. And fundamentally, what we have to know and more importantly understand is that risk change that's happening in real time for those work activities at the worker level are hard to understand and harder to see. They're in the throes of doing their work and they don't anticipate or understand those things because we have stop work. The assumption is the stop work is going to kick in. I'm going to take a step back and reassess. You're in the heat of the work and doing the activities from a worker perspective. When you build that context of the conditions and their mindset of doing that work, when you do your event review, you'll find that they didn't anticipate or fully understand that risk change as it was happening. So how do we create an environment that we don't start work until it's safe? And the third thing is, and that's really the basis of this, is leaders, we don't manage incidents or accidents. They've already happened. But what we manage is controls. So we can manage the layers of protection of those controls. We can actually measure the effectiveness or strength of those controls, how robust they are, how effective they are at preventing negative outcomes. So this led to the creation of the program that was Start When Safe. Every one of you likely have a stop work program. How many of you have a program that's acceptable to start when it's safe? Workers know and understand that they will fail, and when they fail, they want to fail safely. How do we support them in what we do? And what's key about the Start When Safe initiative is we're giving that authority to the employees to create that environment that ensures it's safe to start based on the controls that had already been identified. And we'll talk about how those controls are built. But back to the roundtable in this scenario, if we didn't engage leaders on the front end and have the controlling employer's executive team and the principals from the contractor to agree that we are going to empower your employees to not start work if it's not safe, if we didn't have that conversation and agree on that conversation, this program would not have been successful. In the past, the employer would say, okay, ABC contractor, you can't do that. We'll shop it to XYZ. We know they can get it done. So never took a step back and looked at the outcomes or the risk associated with that work and why wouldn't they do that? So we built Start When Safe based on essential controls. Essential controls are verifiable and they're observable. They're very simple, 3 to 5 things. That SIF checklist, one of those SIF checklists, the average number of items on there was about 17 items. They're kind of like the cardinal rules of safety, follow fall protection requirements. Not talking about the aspects of what do I really need to do. And how we created that is we met with the workers and we built that from their perspective. And it was a really significant investment to do that process. When you talk about, at the time, 1,500 to 2,000 employees working in very remote areas that were only accessible by foot, that you might have to be walking 2 or 3 miles on the ground up over rough terrain, mountains, et cetera, to get to them. But they had a lot to share when we had those conversations. We say Start When Safe encourages. What we actually did is build a process that we could verify and observe. We knew what the Start When Safe criteria was, 3 to 5 things based on the exposure of the tasks that we were doing. So it was very task specific, and that's how the program was created. So I talked about getting the workers together, right? So we canvassed them. You may have seen these 3 questions before. I use these 3 questions all the time. And I use primarily my safety teams to go out and ask these questions. In the month of April last year, we spent a month, 30 days, by the safety team canvassing all the crews and asking these 3 questions. But in the case of the vegetation management work, what are the things that when they fail, they will kill or seriously injure you, right? So understand the aspect of how they think about risk. When this happens, because we don't have perfect systems, perfect processes, perfect people, what keeps you safe? That's an important question. Probe it to help you understand how they're thinking about the risk, how they understand the controls that they have today available to them. And the third one, is that enough? And if there is any hesitation or any concern, that's one that you want to focus on. And again, instead of creating a SIF checklist, I'm going to get very task specific. And we're going to spend a lot of time with the frontline employees implementing, iterating, feedback, iterate, feedback, iterate, feedback in smaller work groups till we get it right, and then we'll expand it out more broadly within an organization. So there were dozens of contractors that were involved in this, but we only selected 2 initially, and we only selected 2 crews initially in terms of the implementation. We had a safety person at every one of those crews to help leadership understand, and I'll show you what these essential controls are in a second. I know you're waiting. But it was also to have feedback sessions at the end of the day. So every day we would collect feedback. What worked, what didn't work, what do we need to tweak? So that process rolled on, and we challenged every step of the way in terms of how do we make it easy for the employees? How do we support them? From a controlling employer perspective, how do we maintain governance to our processes so we don't have a rogue project leader, signing it to another contractor just to get the work done? So those are aspects of what we looked at. Our current pre-job did not couple hazards with controls. It was, again, fundamental to how almost every organization I've ever engaged with looks at doing a pre-job brief. They identify all the exposures that might be present. And then they rely on the worker, the supervisor, to really identify what they should be doing. Not to say that they can't do that, but when we're talking about life or death scenarios, is there something more that we can do to ensure those things are in place? So that is a very brittle system that relies on and dependent upon the worker and their leader in the skill and the craft that they do. I didn't say this, but what do you think the average tenure is of a vegetation management employee, person that cuts down trees? Very short. What do you think the turnover rate is? 6 days a week, 10-hour days, very high turnover, right? So you not only have a brittle system to start with, but you also have a reliance, a heavy reliance on the competency and skill sets to understand the risk, because they've all been trained, right? But you know what that training looks like in a lot of cases. How do you bring it down to a level that's digestible and can have the impact we want it to have? An essential control is defined as anything, this is important, if the essential control is not present, I go to the morgue or I go to the emergency room. If it doesn't meet those 2 criteria, it's not an essential control. So that gets to the bureaucracy side of this. I could put everything on that SIF checklist, and they did. But what are the 3 or 4 things that are most important that must be present, that are observable and verifiable before I begin work? Most organizations focus on hazards or exposure, and they don't think about a specific task, and they don't think about the hazard and control with that specific task. We've taken it from what was world-class SIF prevention to really focused on the work, the activity, and focus on the essential controls for those tasks. We just developed one in our organization where we have a potential exposure to live gas, and there are 9 different tasks that we would potentially encounter that. So depending on that task, there's essential controls created for that. And again, it's 3 to 4 things. It's not hard. So this is what the essential controls card looks like. English and Spanish. Over half the workforce does not speak English. This was created with them, by them, for them. They participated in how we rolled it out. So these are magnets and decals that go on equipment. They said, hey, we have to wear these high visibility shirts. Can we get them in the high visibility and have this printed on the back so people can see those. We modified our checklists to focus on SIF to prevent SIF, and we'll show you that change from a 6-month view to the next month when we implemented this and everybody was trained to deploy that process. So there's an ANSI standard for tree work. What we did is took that ANSI standard, sat down with the employees, made it digestible, added to it based on the 5 scenarios that they encounter. I will also mention that working near lines, hardly ever in the history of the organization had they had any events related to working near energized lines, because that's all they talked about. They didn't talk about these other 4 items. And so it kind of became some of the culture that everybody, they knew that they were in the past, if they failed there, they were not going to be coming back the next day. So we shifted the mindset from not blaming and shaming. We shifted the mindset to create the environment. What does start when safe look like? And then equip them with those 3 or 5 things that are observable, verifiable, and can be captured and tracked. Fall protection doesn't care if you fall. Fall protection cares how you land. We will never predict who will fail, but what we can absolutely guarantee is if you're working at heights, you will fall. Utility workers used to fall off poles all the time. Today, they still fall, they just don't fall off because the protection and systems that have been put in place have been effective in controlling that exposure, right? But if I'm working near or around live gas, which is something a gas worker has to do, what are the 3 to 4 things that I need to do to keep myself safe? And those are the essential controls. I'm going to the morgue or I'm going to the emergency room. So revamping the pre-job brief to incorporate these on the front end. What I say about essential controls? You don't have essential controls for everything. If you have essential controls for everything, it's just another program, right? Things that will kill me, things that I will go to the morgue on, those are essential controls. You're still doing all the other safety stuff that you normally do. This is another added layer of aspect of what we have. Back to the leadership piece, critically important. We are now saying to crews, it's okay not to work that tree. How do you think contractors are paid in that work? By the tree that they work. So what had to change there? You had to change how we paid them. Now I've heard the company has gone back to what they were doing before. I think it's unfortunate, but the reality of that change was supporting this culture. Yeah, it's more expensive to do an hourly versus a piece rate. But if we're committed to preventing these negative outcomes, that's one aspect of that. We identify it from a safety perspective, but we need to work with our leaders to support that change, and they need to drive that change with the organization. So coupling start when safe with stop work allows safety professionals to support, not do, right? We're supporting, we're not doing. That allows leaders to have different conversations with their crews and their employees. Because when we're thinking about SIF prevention, there's only a few things I need to look at and evaluate. And I have a different conversation related to that. And from an employee perspective, they defined the controls and they now have control over when they start work because it's observable and verifiable. So anybody in that crew can say, hey, that's not present. We don't need to start the work. So how do we get there? There's a lot of data you all have. There's no limitation or things that don't exist. But fundamental, we trained everybody in these processes, and that led to the improvement opportunities. So the first rollout of an essential controls plan on 6 months. Wow, 6 months? I got to wait 6 months? The reality is, if you're going through a step change, it takes 6 months. So you're going to be out there collecting. I'm going to train the people that are responsible. So the safety professionals, some leaders. That was that one-day roundtable on SIP prevention, human organizational performance, the essential control process. We're going to spend weeks with crews understanding what are those essential controls. We're going to create those essential controls. And then, like I shared, two companies, two groups within that to roll these out and to iterate, refine, improve, test, and complete that cycle over and over, and then slowly expand it from there. But we had to prove that those are the things that we were going to do. So on Friday, Gary and I are doing what we do in the annual SIF roundtable. We're spending more time on essential controls. We're spending more time on pre-job briefs and incorporating this in. We're talking about metrics, and then we're talking about event reviews and incorporating human organizational performance into that. So Carrie, I'll take these 2 slides and I'll let you close this out. So prior to the process of rolling out essential controls, here's what the observations we're sharing. 17 checklists, SIF checklists, and guess what the findings were? We're all crew members wearing PPE, vests, safety glasses, hard hats. 3 people died the previous year. I'm not suggesting those things aren't important, but if we want to prevent SIFs, we have to focus on SIFs. Through the change, re-education, took us a couple months to get everybody through the process. These are the outcomes that came in the first month. Fewer observations. An observation is a crew visit. Our findings or anything that we find right or wrong. And then stop conditions were things that they didn't meet the essential controls. So it wasn't perfect out of the gate, right? But that's 49 incidents that might have been a serious injury or a fatality that were prevented. So we had to prove we were serious about it and have an issue, and not an issue, but have a discussion. Is this a systemic issue or a local issue with that crew or something larger within the group? All right, make sense? All right, Carrie, close us out.
All right. So the big thing that we were seeing with the checklist that we had traditionally is people focus on what's easy, right? What's easy is hard hat, safety glasses, right? That's why it's so prolific. And it's interesting. It takes a lot more skill, a lot more experience sometimes to evaluate, is this good, is this not good on a traditional checklist? And that's why the big focus to something that's verifiable and observable on an essential control, right? We know exactly what it is. We know how it should look, right? And it's boom, it's there. So that kind of took away that anxiety for people focusing on the major stuff because it wasn't as easy, right? And then assess the systems, not just the behaviors, right? Essential controls was a system, right? And it says, these are the things that we need, right? It was communicated. It was, you had to buy in by the workers and not just going around whack-a-mole saying, boom, you did it wrong and I'm going to, chew you out or fire you and bring in another guy with even less experience, put him in the same situation and expect something different. Okay. But let's talk about these at-risk conditions, right? Or these findings, right? We saw on the previous slide, even when we rolled this out after a big 6-month period and we started this process, within that 1 month, we found almost 50 of these essential controls. And what is an essential control? If it's not in place, it could lead to fatality or significant injury. So we found 49 of those, but the biggest thing that we had to do even prior to this is change how we perceived what one of those findings was, okay? It's not how many people have like golden rules in the organization, okay? Traditionally, a golden rule says 0 tolerance. If I find you not doing this, I'm gonna fire you and walk you out the door, okay? We changed that and basically said, these are gifts, right? When we find these things, it gives us an opportunity to understand why is that happening? Okay, so we approach the worker, we approach the crew and say, hey, essential control says this, these things need to be in place before we started work. This wasn't in place, you started work. Where's the disconnect? Right? Some of the conversations we had was, well, I didn't think you were serious. Do you remember that one?
Right.
Right? I thought you were kidding. So having these conversations allows us to see, right, what are people thinking? Why are they making the decisions they're making? Right? We also had the legacy of, hey, I've got to take that tree down. That's how we get paid. I'm going to do it regardless of the safety, right? I'll take my chances. So we've had that kind of maverick attitude where they think they need to do this despite what we're saying prior to that. Okay. So there's a couple things, right? I have some war stories related to kind of how that looks. So I was in a construction environment and we had several zero tolerance policies, right? And we had checklists. And if they found something significant for an observer, we called it a life threat, right? Or a critical, immediately dangerous to life and health kind of finding. And when we had those, we had the ability to create these notifications or alerts. And traditionally, it went to that project team. Okay, so if I find a guy not tied off, right, I could, stop the work, have that conversation, note it, but then let people know that, hey, I found this, I fixed it, I wanted you to be aware. So it started to take on kind of a, hey, this is a great thing, right? We're sharing this information. I think that's really good. I think we should share it throughout the whole organization. So all of a sudden, instead of just that local project team getting notified, the regional VPs, the corporate VPs were added to these notifications. So a supervisor goes and finds one of these findings, guy not tied off, life threat, hits send, and all of a sudden these notifications go out. What do you think happened? Okay, how many phone calls did he get? Okay, quite a few. Were they good, positive, like, hey, great job? No. What the hell are you doing? What kind of job are you running? So we went from 40 on average life threats a month to 4. And do you think it's because we got better? No, it's because nobody wanted to speak up. So you have to have it, right, before you launch this. And part of HOP, right, is going to give you that foundation, right, to make it a safe environment to speak up. But you can't have a situation like this, a program like this, if you don't have that ability to speak up and not beat people up. Okay, it has to be seen as a gift, right? So coupling the HOP principles, right, is a foundation, right, with these essential controls, right, gives us the ability to gain that insight into what we can do on a daily basis, what can be observed, right, and what can be changed through conversation.
So essential control is defined as what? I'm going to the hospital, I'm going to the morgue.
Right.
Critical controls, other things that we've identified and talked about in the past really focus at a hazard level, right? I'm working at heights, I'm working in excavation, I'm working around energized equipment. What made this work and what makes it continue to work is that the essential controls are simple to understand. They're 100% observable and 100% verifiable. But you can't just go roll this out in safety and say, hey, this is what we're doing. To Carrie's point about the 40 and 4, if you don't have commitment from leaders and they're not going to support the process and they're not going to respond in the appropriate way, they are going to derail this initiative and you're going to go back to where you were. So I would encourage all of you to think about what's currently happening in all of our organizations across the US. Severity and fatalities are going up. They're not going down. If you always do what you always done, you always get what you always got. And even though we've invested a lot in SIF prevention, using the SIF and FSI checklist you've created, I would challenge you to think about, is that where we want to be? Is that giving us the resolve that we need in our organization? If you're not taking it down to the task level, in my opinion, you're missing an opportunity. Taking it to the task level is hard. It takes more time, but you want something that's going to be sustainable. And you want to be able to support your employees in what they do. And they're going to appreciate that because they're participating in you in the creation. So hopefully this resonated with you. Hopefully we've given you some tools that will be helpful to you, and look forward to having any questions in the future